Thank you so much for coming. This is a bit of an impromptu. Hey, we can move with the times. This budget spring statement was just like last week. Let's think about what that means for us. So thank you so much, Professor Huw Dixon, for agreeing to do this really quick reflection. And something that, you know, probably you'll see in the eyes of a lot of team members, this is our first foray into the bold new world of Teams. So it's new for us. We loved Zoom and we did all we could to try and say, please let us keep it. But we have been unable to keep Zoom. We are now making sure that we can give the same service and experience with Teams. But it is going to be a bit, interesting, I think, as we get to grips with this new technology. So please bear with us. Thanks so much for joining us online. We'd really appreciate your feedback as to how well it went online as well, because we really pride ourselves on the ability to be hybrid. For us, it's the most important thing so that we're as accessible as possible. So let's hope that Teams goes well. Thanks so much. Right, is this going to click and work? Yes, I'm Sarah Lethbridge. I'm the Pro Dean for External Engagement here in the Business School. Come and talk to me if you wanted to do a shared event, if you're interested in any of our short courses, you're interested in our part-time MBA. I'll talk more about that later. We've got a couple of good events coming up. 11th of June, breakfast briefing with Rhiannon Richards, who's the BBC Cymru director. So really excited about that one. And that's hosted by our friend, Professor Laura McAllister. And also we're promoting for the first time a CPD course, Customer Insights and Analytics with Generative AI. Yikes alive. Delivered by our brilliant academic, Simon Jang. He teaches a module on our MBA in marketing analytics, and some of the students that have come on that have absolutely testified that it's completely revolutionized their business model. So if you're interested in AI, interested in marketing analytics, really it's a good course for you. I skipped over that Business in the Community World Earth Day event because I don't think it's happening anymore. Is that correct, team? The World Earth Day. Yeah, don't get excited about that one. It's not happening. So, it's going to be later on in the year, apparently, depending on who can attend from the government. So, just a little flag about our brilliant Amber accredited part-time MBA, full-time MBA, MBA with AI. Next intake is September. It's a really fantastic programme. There are scholarships available. And what we pride ourselves in Cardiff Business School is, yes, teaching you how to make money. Yes, teaching the profit side of things and how to be an economic powerhouse, but also to do that responsibly and how you bring your people with you on the way. So really brilliant MBA that we're very proud of. And please come and find out more about it. Talk to us. We'll be happy to take you through the programme. Look at that poor little slide now. Contact us. We are here to help. Executive Education at cardiff.uk. It used to be John Parry Jones's email on that slide. I'm going to try not get upset. But yeah, John is sadly retiring selfishly at the end of this month. So we love you, John. Thank you for everything that you've given us. But the team's still here. Get in touch with the more generic and less personal executive-education email address. But we're here to help, and John's not going anywhere too far. You're probably going on loads of holidays, but you're not going to be a total stranger, are you, John? Hope not, anyway. So please join our community if you haven't already signed up. You can receive all the information about our events, conferences, short courses. But really importantly, we want you to feel part of the school. We're doing some amazing research and getting involved in amazing initiatives. Last night we had She's Not Your Rehab here in the Business School, which is a New Zealand-based organisation desperately trying to work with men and boys to challenge perceptions around masculinity and to tackle gender-based violence. So there's so much good things happening in the school. If you're part of our community, you'll hear about them and you'll be able to attend. This is being recorded. We will be taking photos. If you're unhappy about that, just please tell a member of the team and we can make sure that you're not included in any of our publicity materials. And yeah, Hugh's going to do his reflection on what happened last week and what it means for the future. And at the end, there's going to be a good juicy Q&A session, which I'm going to try and field, hoping that it doesn't involve me answering any A-level economics questions. And if you're joining us online, please use the chat function to ask your questions. But also in the room, please wait for a microphone. Otherwise, people online won't be able to hear you. So that's it from me. Thank you so much, Huw, for doing this for us. And I'll hand over now to you.
OK, so firstly, what I'd just say is I'm presenting this with my National Institute of Economic and Social Research hat on. That's largely because most of what I'm presenting emanates from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, where I have a role as a lead of economic measurement. So I've given my thanks to colleagues in particular, but not exclusively, Stephen Millard, Ben Caswell, Ed Cornforth, and Monica George-Michael, and many others. It's a very big team. Some key messages. I'll just start with a little bit of a key message. So GDP growth, this is what NISA thinks is going to be about 1.5% in 2025. We'll be coming back to that, driven primarily by the rising government expenditure, which we saw in Reeves 1. Reeves 1 is the budget last year. So inflation's set to increase. So we'll come to some more figures, but certainly it's going to rise this year and it'll fall back to target sometime in 2026. Monetary policy interest rates probably going to settle down at 4%. If you're lucky, they might be as low as 3%, but probably around about 4%, those of you with mortgages. Beware. I won't talk much about the labour market, but it's remaining tight and wage growth is still high. Currently, it's about 5%. I come back. You can ask me questions about that, but I won't be covering it much. The spring statement overall, so you can go home now if you want. Overall, that had a big effect on the previous budget. It's more of a reshuffling, moving the deck chairs around. Although you might not think that if you're on disability benefits or other benefits, but overall, from a macroeconomic perspective, it hasn't had a huge effect. More details about that. Housing, again, I won't have time to go into this. This could be a large effect. Housing is a big flagship policy of the current government, and indeed it's one which is very, very important, I think, for the long-run development of Britain, because we've had a huge housing shortage which developed over decades. But this is going to take time, and so I'm not really going to focus so much on that. But I can talk about it a bit more if you want. OK, let's step out and look at the world. It's always good to look at the world. We tend to be looking at what's going on. There's a map of the world. You see the little circle there. So we can zoom in a little bit on that. So this thing here, it's a circle. It's the smallest circle you can draw on a world surface, which gives you half the world population. And so there's half the world's population live in that circle. It moves around a little bit depending on what people mean by circle and the surface of the Earth and so on. But that's what it looks like. Now, why do I raise that? Because, well, you can look at that's half the world's population, and you can look at this. Sorry, it's a slightly I wasn't able to do it, but the IMF map of world growth. This is quite an important map. Basically, the darker the colour, the more rapid the growth. And as you can see, well, it doesn't really work anyway. That circle, most of that circle is a darker colour green. The implication of that is that the economic growth that's happening is happening in that part of the world. China, India, Southeast Asia. That's where economic growth is happening at the moment. It's been the same for the last 5 or 10 years, and it's going to continue being the same, I think. There are other areas like Africa's doing quite well at the moment, but that's the world. So that's all I'm going to say about the world. But it's good to have that as a framing for what we're going to look at now. So let's just break down the world a little bit. So world growth at 2.8%. Just under 3%. It's come down. It used to be 6%, but now it's about 3%. The emerging markets, it's about 4%. And in advanced economies, it's 1.8%. So we can break that down. So if you look at Britain is part of the G7 and the advanced economies, so we're in the low growth part of the world. And the high growth part of the world is the emerging economies, and you can see particularly there BRICS. BRICS gets far too little coverage in British press, but it's a sort of a corporate. It's a bit like OECD for developing countries or emerging markets. And there's BRICS consists of the original BRICS members, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. but they've just recently had Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and most importantly, just a few months ago, Indonesia, because of course Indonesia is very much in that circle. We just saw it's a big, vibrant, growing economy. And there are several partner members as well. So that's where all the growth in the world is. So let's now come into Britain and Wales. So let's look at UK Rachel Reeves. Let's just remind ourselves of the framework she's sort of setting up her budget in. And there are two fiscal rules. One is to balance the budget in a 5-year period by the end of the Parliament. And the other is to lower the debt-GDP ratio by the end of the Parliament. Now, there was quite a lot of coverage of this. I'll just remind you. There's this thing called PSNFL. Now, if you've all, which is debt redefined. Now, these acronyms, if you're as old as I have, the government is often introducing new definitions for various things, and this is the latest. Now, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on these fiscal rules, because what we know about fiscal rules is governments put forward fiscal rules, and then as soon as they run into any problems, they abandon them straight away. That happened with the Great Financial Crisis and so on. And the fiscal rules in recent history, Gordon Brown started them off, and there's been various variations on them, but they're all roughly similar. What's this PSNFL? Does it make a big difference? Well, essentially, the public sector net debt is the old definition, and this more or less meshes in with the IMF and the way that these things are looked at globally. So they look at the debt obligations, that's government debt or gilts, net of various liquid financial assets, where liquid financial assets are defined very narrowly, foreign exchange reserves, cash and all that sort of stuff. And that's currently just under 100% of GDP. If you just look at our gross debt, what the government owes, then it's well over 100% now. The new one, public sector net financial liabilities, I don't want to go into the details here, but it's just a much broader sense of what an asset is and a liability is. And it includes things like pensions and so on and so forth. So that's currently around about 80%. That's lower. But it doesn't, in terms of the fiscal rule, it does make a difference, but basically, the aim is to get this thing falling. So the fact that the level is lower isn't the crucial point. They're still going to have to get the thing falling by the end of the 5-year period or 4-year period. So that's it. So it may give them a bit more fiscal headspace, and that's certainly what Rachel Reeves and her advisors hoped. Okay, so I'll just say there's 3 main sources for what I'm going to say. One is the Bank of England monetary report from February. Second is a NISA Winter Economic Outlook, February 2025, and that says a bit about Wales, so that's quite useful. And then there's the Office for Budget Responsibility, which came out last week. Those are 3. Now, the February reports may seem really out of date. In the days of Trump, February seems like last century. I mean, who knows what, But in fact, it's pretty much up to date, really. And as I say, the spring statement, it reflects things that have happened since then, but it doesn't really change that much, really. So let's look at output. So, sorry, it's a fan chart. You either like these things or you don't. But if you read the text, that's the main thing. So what NISA says is GDP growth is going to be at 1.5% in 2025 and 2026. Don't worry, I'm going to come on to the OBR next. If you've been listening to the BBC News. Budget policies boosted growth in the short run. So basically, look, there's a big fiscal stimulus given by the previous budget. In demand terms, anyway, leave aside national insurance contributions and so on. I haven't really got time to go into that. But certainly, on the demand side, it boosted it. So that NISA thinks, my colleagues at NISA and me, think that there's going to be quite a lot of growth, certainly for a couple of years. But beyond that, it's not going to last for very long. And essentially, the stimulus will fade and we'll be left with our old friend business investment, which, well, you can guess what that's going to do. So it's going to peter out. We'll come back to the actual figures soon, but you can see growth is going to remain below 2%, so it'll be in the range of 1 to 2%. Tariffs. Well, we've got Liberation Day, or whatever it's called. It's today or tomorrow. I can't remember. It's today, I think. So I'm happy to talk about that, although I won't be much on that here. Now, that's NISA's view. The OBR takes a slightly different view, and basically, so. What does this mean? There's a yellow line. If you look at the bottom, that's the year. So we've just finished 2024. The yellow line is what the OBR thought was going to happen before the last budget, last year. and the blue line is what they think is happening now. And as you'll see, in 2025, last November, they thought we were going to get 2% growth this year, largely because of these fiscal expansionary effects of the budget. But now they think it's only going to be 1%. So they take a much more pessimistic view of what's going to happen to real output this year, although in the longer run, it's going to be more similar. So that's it. So that's really quite a big change in the forecast. Now, we can set this in context. I mean, really what it comes down is to the timing of the effects of last year's budget, whether you think it's going to come through this year or next year. So that's part of it. And you can see that really, if you compare the three things, so we've got three lines there. The green line, where they're all common up until the end of 2025, and then they sort of deviate. The black line is NISA, which has a higher GDP growth in 2025. The Bank of England and the OBR have a more pessimistic view, but then the OBR becomes more optimistic in the longer run. So it's partly to do with timing, but in sort of over the 4 years, it doesn't really make, if you're looking over the Reeves time horizon, it doesn't really make a huge difference. Although if you're living through it, it might make a difference if you lose your job or whatever in 2025 or 2026. But that's roughly what's happening. So the OBR is much more optimistic about trend growth, which would mean growth in the slightly longer run. So I'll have a quick look at Wales. Unfortunately, I can't say too much about Wales here. Sorry about that, but it's simply because these analyses don't say very much about it. But if we just go back to the autumn budget, I'll just focus on two main things. Firstly, we've got the wages, the natural living wage and the national minimum wage. Those both increased in the November budget at the start of April. That's probably going to have a greater positive impact on Wales, because there's a lot of people in Wales, a high proportion of people in Wales are on these wages. So they're going to have more money, so they might be spending more money, assuming they can. But that assumes they can keep their jobs. And, of course, employers' national insurance contributions, which went up in the last budget, that probably affects Wales more than it does most of England, most of Britain. And that's because labour costs are a greater share relative to profits. So in Wales, the share of labour is 38%. Whereas the UK average is 42.5%, and London it's a lot lower. So essentially, because labour's a more important thing, and that's linked to employment, so if employers' national insurance contributions are related to their labour, what they spend on labour, so that's probably going to have a bit bigger effect. So it's a bit of a mixed bag on the effect of the autumn budget on Wales. And if we look at the spring statement, there's welfare cuts, which we'll be coming back to a little bit. Obviously, these will have a disproportionate effect on Wales because more people in Wales are on welfare. Defence is going to go up, at least in the medium term. That may have some sort of positive thing. We'll come a little bit back to that. I don't have specific data on Wales, but I'll show you a little bit on Britain. It's not going to have any effect, I don't think, in the short run. It's more of a medium-term thing, a bit like housing. So overall, the spring statement, I would say, is probably a little bit of bad news for Wales. That's my own personal take. But it's hard to. I haven't got any figures to beyond these general observations to say on that. But we can come back to that. We'll come back to tariffs if you want to do it, but we have looked at tariffs. What about inflation? Essentially, what we think inflation is going to rise in the middle of the year. So in NISA, we think it's going to go up to 3%. And that's largely driven by increases in national insurance contributions and increases in the natural minimum wage. That's going to exert upward pressure on prices. And inflation is going to remain at above the Bank of England target for quite a while. Now, again, there's a difference here. So our colleagues at the Bank of England and the OBR are much more pessimistic about inflation. They think inflation is going to go up to not quite 4%, but 3.8%, peaking in the middle of the year. And that's because they see that it could be that they're putting a bigger weight on the increases in rates, water bills and so on that we've just heard about that are coming through in April. So it'll soon become clear, I think, when the April figures come out and in May, who's right. But we're not, I won't say optimistic because we still think inflation is going to go up, but we think it's going to go up to something like 3.4% or something like that, whereas they think it's going to go up to 3.8 or more. But they all agree that inflation will be back on target by 2027. Okay, so that's a quick view of inflation, but we're not really talking about inflation. But then there's monetary policy. So there has been a bit of a change here. So I think back in 2025, there's a question of what is, it's sometimes called, you see the word R star, but what is the long run interest rate going to settle down at? Okay, for those of you who are below a certain age, you think, well, 0 is a natural rate for interest rates. You know, interest rates should go back down to 0. But of course, for those of us who are a bit older, remember, you know, interest rates, the bank rates in the past that was a historical exception, and they're always higher than that, 5% or 6%. And so what we think, and indeed the OBR and BOE all agree here, and indeed the markets agree, is that probably interest rates are going to settle down at a level between 3 and 4%. So currently the OBR and NISA think it's 4%. Previously, NISA thought it was 3.25%. It oscillates a little bit. They're not quite sure. It depends what you think the long-run equilibrium rate of interest is going to be so it's inflation plus something. So the real rate of interest is what you have over and above inflation. Inflation, if it's on target at 2%, so you've got to add on a bit to that. And it depends what you think the real return on capital is in technical terms. And that's it. Of course, these are just but certainly if you have mortgages, I wouldn't be expecting them to go down to 0.5% or 2%. They're going to remain quite high, unfortunately, sadly, for those of you on mortgages. Right. So that's monetary policy. I'm not going to say much about labour market, so I can come back to that if you like it. How am I doing? Oh, I'm doing quite well for time. Yeah, I'm not doing too badly. Okay, well, I could maybe just say something about the labour market. Okay, so wage growth, currently it's 5%. And I say currently it's 5%. That's based on the latest ONS figures, which are a few months out of date. I think it goes up to January now. So they take a 3-month average from the minimum wages, the wage survey. And I think it's up to January now, so it's November, December, January, and it's 5%. So it's not quite up to the bang up to date. It's 5%, and they think that the forecast is that it's going to be something like 4%. It's going to come down a bit, but it's still going to be 4% this year and next. But there's a lot of evidence of saying that the labour market's tightening. This thing here is the ratio of vacancies to unemployment. So the vacancies, that's the number of jobs that are advertised or whatever, to unemployment. So if there are more vacancies to unemployment, this is on this line here, then this thing will be higher. And so if it's low, so if it's high, it means it's tight. There's lots of vacancies relative to the unemployment pool. If it's low, there's not many vacancies relative to the unemployment pool. And the black line is some long-run average. So you can see we're still above the black line there. It's been coming down. So after the pandemic, there was a big spike. There's labour shortages. You're all aware of that. People withdrawing and so on, not withdrawing their labour supply. Inactivity went up. So unemployment effectively didn't increase, but the labour force decreased. But it's coming down now. So it remains tight, but it's getting less tight. And there's a question of, I think most people think the equilibrium, if you like, in the labour market will be around about 4.5% unemployed. So we're going to get there, but you know that means that wage growth isn't really going to tail off in the near future. What about what happened there? I pressed the wrong. Oh no, it's okay. I pressed the wrong button. So again, there's a bit of a difference here between the three. We've got 3 different forecasts here for unemployment. Now, the Bank of England thinks that unemployment's going to go up, basically. So it's going to be about 5%. So this is the unemployment rate here. So it's going to be about 5%. So the bit on the right hand is the forecast. So this is what's been going on up till now. And the Bank of England forecasts it's going to go up. Not dramatically, but it's going to go up. The OBR is a bit more optimistic. It thinks it's going to go down. And we're in the middle. NISA's in the middle. But you can see there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to the unemployment rate. That partly reflects the fact these participation rates are moving round, and it's only really, people are only counted as part of the labour force if they're actively looking for work. And, you know, a lot of people stopped looking for work after COVID, and I don't know what they're doing, but they're doing something, or they're cultivating their gardens or doing something. And so, there's partly, will people come back into the labour force, or are they permanently gone? And what's happening with AI and all that sort of stuff. So there's a little bit of uncertainty. So the fact the three forecasts are there, there's some uncertainty. And in fact, that's what we see throughout all these forecasts. These three institutions, which are major bodies for forecasting these sorts of things, they all sort of diverge a bit, which normally there's a lot of consensus with these forecasts. So that's just really an indicator to you of the uncertainty. So you can take what I say with a little bit of a pinch of salt, but you can certainly see the bounds of what's likely to happen in the future. So that's labour market. Spring statement. Well, the current UK fiscal framework puts emphasis on constraints on fiscal policy rather than objectives. So when they're justifying what's been going on in the spring statement, the cuts to welfare and so on, they were really talking about the need to do something to meet the fiscal rules. And this was largely because there's just been in the last few months a bit lower growth than expected, so less tax revenue. And with the OBR forecast for only 1% growth this year, that's a significant reduction in revenue for this year. So that means things are worse for the government finances as a result. So they reacted to that by cutting something. They had to cut something. So what do they cut? They cut welfare and benefits. So that's sort of it. So really, that's really the way that the cuts were justified by the Chancellor, and in particular, it was focused on the cuts in welfare spending. Now, obviously, they're going to impact quite rapidly. They're going to reduce personal income of the poorest households in the country, and the poorest households in the country tend to spend all the money they get. Obviously, they're poor, so they tend to be income cash constrained, so they tend to spend everything that they get. So that's going to be £4.8 billion taken out of consumer expenditure, which probably isn't going to have a very good impact on these. So the forecasts we had before were from before the spring statement. I should have made that clear. So they're not new forecasts that have been made after the spring statement, although the OBR did know what was happening, so it evaluated. So the OBR, sorry, I need to be accurate there. The NISA and the Bank of England, the ones done in February, didn't include the effect of the spring statement. The OBR does. I should have been clear about that. Apologies for not being clear about that. So maybe their slightly more pessimistic take on output might be the fact that they're reflecting this cut in welfare spending. So, sorry, I'm going the wrong way there. So the welfare cuts, let's just see why this is, and we've got the thing there. So in a shorter run, we've got lower growth than expected, less revenue, the need to cut expenditure to meet the fiscal rule. Rule 1. Welfare, there's got the welfare cuts of 4.8 billion. Secondly, there's a longer run aim, which is to make space for the increase in defence expenditure. So the government's made a decision, we need to increase defence expenditure in the medium terms, longer run. And one way to make space for that is to cut welfare payments. And of course, there's obviously immediate concerns of money being paid to Ukraine, but also more general rearmament that's going to be happening over the next coming years. And once they've done this, if you put all these things together over the 5-year period, the OBR thinks, and I'll show you the diagram, that what was going to be, we're going to have a surplus in the government budget, and the debt to GDP ratio will be falling. So this is, if you like, the statement has provided the fiscal headroom, is the phrase they use. I think universities use that phrase as well, don't they? The fiscal headroom, in terms of these rules, to be met by 2029. 2029 is a financial year, 2029-30, shorthand. Okay, and we can actually, but the thing is that these cuts won't improve the UK's trend growth, nor place the public finances on a fundamentally sustainable path. It's more of a rearrangement of the deck chairs, really. And it really calls into question, or we would question at NISA, and I'd agree as my colleagues at NISA on this one, that the necessity of the spending cuts it's not obvious what they have. They could have been introduced over a longer period. Why they have to be done on such a large scale now, it's not really clear. There might be a political incentive, which is simply the government has a 4 or 5 year period. They do all the bad things at the beginning. People complain, but 3 years down the line, they've forgotten about it. things are looking a bit better, and they'll vote for the government again. So it could be a political calculus of that kind, and this government wouldn't be the first one to do that. It's been done before. Anyway. And my colleagues at NISA have been arguing that we need a new fiscal framework, but I haven't got time to go into that, so you can ask me about that. But that's it. So let's look at the spring statement. So what is the likely effect, before we get on to the things, what's the effect of increase in military defence spending on GDP? So if you have an increase, they're aiming for a 6.4 billion increase in defence spending by 2029-30. That's really going to have very little effect. So the vertical axis, that gives you the percentage difference from base. That's the additional growth you get by having a bit of military expenditure. And it's very, very small, because 6.4 billion isn't a huge amount of money. So you're going to spend a bit more on defence, so it's not going to make a little bit. It will have some boost effect, 0.1% of GDP. But it's not really going to have it's not going to be like rearmament before World War II or something like that, which had a much bigger effect. It may have a longer run positive impact on GDP through increasing supply capacity and productivity and so on, spin-offs and so on, but it might do. So let's now look at our two fiscal rules. What's happening to the current budget deficit to GDP? So this was the first fiscal rule, looking at the budget deficit. So really, in order to get, the aim is here to get this thing down to zero by the end of the, or maybe have a bit of a surplus by the 2029-30. Why is that? Well, because the second fiscal rule, if you don't want the debt to GDP ratio to be increasing, you sort of need to really have more or less have a budget balance. There's a bit of detail there, I can talk about it, but that's roughly what you need. So you can see here the OBR and NISA basically both see the deficit as going down. The OBR, as I say, is a bit more recent, so they see it as going into a surplus. But it will, by the end of the Parliament, you've got down to zero there. So that gives you a bit of fiscal headroom, as they say, so it's going to meet that target. So that's the first fiscal rule is ticked, so Rachel Reeves will be happy, for now anyway. And secondly, this debt to GDP ratio, this Pussenuffle, sounds like some Pussenuffle, yeah. Somebody should write a children's book about it, probably, the Pussenuffle. Basically, by the end of the period, at the end, you see it doesn't really go down, it's still going up, but the little bit at the end, it's actually coming down right at the end. And that's helped by strong GDP growth, because remember the OBR is quite optimistic about GDP growth in the medium term, and also a bit of persistent inflation. Inflation does wonders for public finances, basically because the government is the biggest debtor, and inflation means that what they owe to everybody else goes down in value because of inflation. I'll come back to that if you want, but that's it. But one of the things to say is that rising borrowing costs are really acting as a real constraint on fiscal policy. So I talked about interest rates, the Bank of England policy rate being 4%. Well, because of that means government debt, the interest on government debt is going to be 5% or something like that, probably in the long run, certainly 4% plus. If you've got a debt to GDP ratio around about 100%, not the Pussenuffle, but the other one, that means about 5% of your GDP is going on interest payments. So a lot of governments around the world are finding this. They're used to zero interest rates, well, almost zero interest rates. They could borrow for almost nothing. Now, when they're refinancing that debt, it's a bit like people with refinancing their mortgages. Suddenly they find that rather than having a 3% mortgage, you've got a 6% mortgage now. And it's exactly the same with the government, and they've got this quite huge amount to pay back, which again acts as another constraint on what's going on. Okay, as I've got time for housing, I'll just say a quick word about housing. Again, there's a lot of detail here, which we've had a chronic failure to build for, well, it's post-Thatcher, basically. Remember, one of the main sources of new housing was local councils building council houses. I don't know, hands up if you remember what a council house is or was. And so they used to build lots of these, and then it sort of stopped more or less after the Thatcher, and it's never really recovered since then. We've had chronic underinvestment in new housing. And we've also had rapid population growth in the last 2 decades. So every time I hear the population figure for the UK, it's bigger than what it was before. Whereas for a long time, it was 56 million till the mid-90s, late 90s. Anyway, Reeves seeks to build 1.5 million homes by 2029. So just to give you a bit of perspective on that, currently the amount of new houses being built is under 200,000. It's 150, 170, and it varies a little bit from year to year, but that's roughly what's going on. So really you need a 50%, you need to increase to an average of 300,000 per year to meet that target. And quick note, they're not going to do 300,000 this year, so they need to have a bit more later on. So it's a lot. Now, to give you another thing, how big is this for the UK housing stock? Well, there's about 27 million homes in the UK. So what they're looking at is a 5% increase in the number of homes. So it is a substantial increase. So there are lots of problems here. In order to get this, so they've focused on unlocking regulations, easing planning permission. That's something that clearly needs to be done. We have quite a slow planning process in the UK. Maybe there's a good reason for having a slow process. Everything needs to be done, but certainly if you want to build that, you're going to need to unlock that regulations. That's going to take time, though. That's going to take time. But there's lots of other issues that need to be dealt with. Just the basic issue of capacity. If you have an industry which has been building 150,000 homes per year, and you want them to build 300,000 homes per year, that's doubling the output. You've got to get loads of people to do it. You've got to get people to build homes. You need the equipment, everything. So there's a big issue of capacity, labour supply, etc. here. And that's something that needs to be dealt with. And it's not clear. For example, if you want to import people, you might want to import people from abroad, get lots of people coming in, bricklayers or whatever it is, electricians or whatever they do to make houses nowadays. You'll need to, with the current skilled immigration rules, you can only get skilled immigrations in if they paid more than quite a lot of money. I think it's £39,000. It's quite a lot of money. So unless you're paying your bricklayers £39,000, which maybe they're worth it, maybe they should be paying bricklayers £39,000. But currently the market rate for bricklayers is less than that. But I suspect the market rate for bricklayers and all these things is going to shoot up quite rapidly if this happens. But there's a labour supply issue. So there's quite a lot of issues that need to be dealt with. And I'm sure they're thinking about all these things. But that's it. But having said that, I think this is a historic chance for the Labour government to do this. It's got a big majority in Parliament, even though it's very unpopular at the moment. It's got a big majority in Parliament. It can do it. And as I say, it's something that even if we go back to Blair, government after government has kicked the can down the road. They haven't really dealt with this, largely because of this NIMBY thing. They're afraid of offending voters in the southeast of England, because we need lots of houses in the southeast of England. We don't need them in Northumbria or elsewhere. We need a lot more houses in London and the regions around there, and that the people who live there don't want more houses built. They tend to vote Tory, and the Conservative governments weren't willing to do this, and the Labour governments wanted to get votes in those areas. They weren't willing to do it. So I think that this is the only, if we don't do it this time, it'll never get done and we'll just have a permanent housing shortage. Having said that, this is not a UK problem, it's a world problem. I was in China a few months ago and they've got a housing problem there, housing shortage there, housing prices are very high, even though they've fallen a lot. Everywhere around the world, there's a housing, well, not sure everywhere around the world, but in most places in the world, there's a housing shortage. So it's not a UK-specific issue, it's a problem across the whole world. And so maybe there's, the ability, I might be a bit optimistic to think that Keir Starmer's administration is going to be able to solve this problem. But certainly we need more homes, I think, and we need more homes mainly in the southeast of England and the London area. But we need homes elsewhere as well. I mean, but that's the focus. So that's housing. So just to finish, yeah, I'm doing okay. Got my 30 minutes. Yeah. So the GDP growth this year will be about 1.5%, largely driven by government expenditure. This was pre-budget, so it may be a bit less than that. The OBR said 1%, but the 1% I think was maybe inspired by the cut in welfare spending, which we'll have. That £4.6 billion that isn't going to welfare will be taken from those poorer households who would have spent it anyway. There's going to be inflation is going to rise in April. We'll see the exact figure when the figures come out in May. lots of things going up. So it's interesting to see. It's going to remain above target for the rest of this year. But I think it's broadly under control. I don't think there's any, well, geopolitics. I'm not going to talk about geopolitics, but there's lots of things that could go wrong around the world. If there's a war between Iran and Israel and America, that would cause loads of problems and the usual suspects. But leaving aside geopolitics, we're not going to have a big spike. May go as high as 4%, but I don't think it's going to get much bigger than that. Although some people think it will do. They may be right, but I don't think they are. Overall, the UK Spring Statement, prospects are broadly unchanged, but there's obviously a lot of redistribution going on there. I say the shuffling of the cards. So some people have lost, some people are losers, people on disability benefits and welfare payments. Some people may be winners in the longer run, the defence companies and people associated with that. And that's about it, really. So, any questions?
So much, Huw. I understood it. So thank you. Any questions for Huw? At the back there. Thanks. Wait for a microphone. That's great. Thank you. And if introduce who you are. Thanks.
I'm sat here at the back. My name's Dawn, by the way. I have lived in 44 countries around the world. So I do know about some of the issues that you've mentioned there. I write books for a living on government and corporate corruption. And I've been sat here. And one of the things that has come across is the lack of awareness of people that are actually suffering because of this type of arrogance that I've seen on the slides. Now, I don't mean to offend anyone, but when we're looking at taking money away from people who have been traumatized by things such as COVID or mental health issues, and they're suffering, and we are seeing an increase in suicide, and you're taking money away from the people who could actually do a lot of jobs, but they're not getting the support, that we're seeing waiting times for people to get mental health up to 6, 12, 18 months. Sometimes 6 days is too long for someone to get mental health treatment. And you're taking money away from these people and the necessary services to put them into warmongering and supporting the war effort. Don't you think if you're the Institute of Social Research, there should be more research into the social impact of the disturbing budget report that you've just done and presented up there? And no disrespect meant to you, but you have quite a dismissive attitude to the people of the poorer end of the scale.
Huw?
Yeah,
Huw hasn't made all of these things happen. He's just calmly reporting from an economic perspective the realities of the situation. Over to you.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. No, I agree 100%. I mean, I always smile, whatever I'm saying, as people know, my colleagues know. So I'm not being dismissive at all. Now, I think it's a terrible policy myself. I don't think we should be, we shouldn't be cutting this thing. I think my own personal view is I don't think rearmament is really necessary. But that's my own personal view. Yeah, I agree that it's terrible for the people concerned. Completely, 100%. I agree with that. So, but that doesn't mean I'm just looking at it from the bigger picture. Not saying better picture, but the bigger picture in terms of what it means for the economy as a whole. And my colleagues at NISA do actually do a lot of research on the poorest households and destitution around the UK. And unfortunately, I'm here on my own because it's 8 o'clock. They couldn't come here this morning, but they do a lot of research on poverty and destitution in the UK and the effect of policies. I'm quite sure there will be a NISA report coming out very soon on the issues that you've raised. Thank you, Dawn.
Thanks. And as a business school, we care deeply about these issues.
Yes.
Have numerous research groups looking at how we can actually help the most vulnerable in society. Thank you. Over there.
I do wonder whether I didn't really talk much about tariffs. Yeah, but housing. Let's just look at tariffs. Those are tariffs on stuff we sell to America. So it's going to affect those people who are involved in trade with America. And let's just remind you that America is our largest export market. We're a bit unique in this sense. So for Germany, for example, China is the biggest export market. So we actually largely, well, cars have been in the news, but we also services and so on. We also sell services and so on. So they're our biggest. So we will be affected, but it'll be those export sectors like cars and other things, accountancy services, management services. Also, a range of stuff will be affected. So housing really isn't going to be affected by those tariffs at all. Well, it will be affected because the tariffs might affect things around the world. And in fact, NISA has a global trade model called NIGEM, which has done this. If you want, they did do a simulation, a flashback, and I think that the impact of looking worldwide will be something we could lose up to about 2% of GDP level. It's a much smaller impact than Brexit, but still a significant one. But that's, from the point of view of us, it's not us. We can still do free trade, and I think we should be doing free trade. I mean, basically, we're a small economy. Well, we're not that small, but we're small enough in world terms that there's not really a big argument for us putting tariffs on anybody. And so I don't think really we should respond to the tariffs. If you're a big economy like the European Union, then it's a slightly different story. Or if you like China, the big players, you can play this tit for tat game, Prisoner's Dilemma. You tariff me, I'll tariff you, and you can do it. But if we're a little country like us, relatively little country, there's no point in doing that, really, apart from symbolic thinking, we'll get them back. We're standing up to Trump, somebody was saying on the news today. We'll stand up to Trump. Well, there's no point standing up to Trump if it's just you're spiting your nose to Stu to face. So it'll just be self-harm, really, right? If we do something like that. So I don't. So the housing. So where do we get most of our stuff from for housing? I'm not quite sure. I'm not a housing expert, but certainly we'll get a lot of stuff from China. And China trade between Britain and China shouldn't be directly affected by Trumpian tariffs, and trade with Europe shouldn't be affected by Trumpian tariffs. Trade, so the Trumpian tariffs shouldn't really affect our non-US trade, and it really only affects our exports. Because our imports from the US won't be affected by Trumpian tariffs unless we put tariffs on them, in which case we will have to pay tariffs on their stuff.
You any online questions?
Nothing yet, Sarah, no.
Calvin.
Yeah, thanks, Huw. Very interesting. I was interested in your chat about housing supply and the need to build new houses, particularly in the southeast. Where there's not enough water to build new houses, so we better crack on with the reservoirs as well. Can Britain ever have a significantly higher rate of sustained growth if it remains the most centralised economy in Europe?
So who's that, sorry?
Can it ever have a higher rate of economic growth if it remains the most centralised economy in Europe?
Britain?
Geographically centralised.
Sorry, where's this, sorry?
Britain. We're the most centralised economy in Western Europe. Everything happens in London and the southeast. Is that a break on growth? So we just predict and provide, like we do with roads, you build more houses in the southeast, but you don't address the underlying problem of distribution across geography.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on the water issue, I've got friends who live in Cambridge, and there's a great debate about building housing in Cambridge to do with the water table. And the thing is that since privatisation, basically water companies have stopped building new reservoirs. I mean, we can look into this, but there's been a underinvestment in new reservoirs. So that is a problem which we're facing now, and I think part of that's something that does need to be addressed. The housing, we've always been. We need a regional policy, and I think there needs to be a regional policy, and there needs to be cooperation with the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So we do, but in a sense, you've got to look at where people want to live and where the economic base of the country is, and even going back to Roman times. And if you go back 150 years, the population of London was about 6 or 7 million, and the the population of Britain was about half what it was or less. So London has always been a very dominant part of the British economy, like it or loathe it. And it's become less dominant since the Second World War. You've got the growth of big cities like Manchester, Bristol, and so on. So it has become less centralised. And we should try to encourage it to be less centralised. And, you know, I'm from Swansea, the DVLC. We all send ourselves off to the DVLC. There are various bits of regional policy which governments have pursued in the past, but there's a gravitational pull to the southeast, which, you know, partly it's to do with the geographical location. It used to be because it was the most fertile agricultural land in Roman times. That's why it was a very, very popular place. Now it's other reasons. You know, it's just close to Europe, and Europe still remains our major trading partner, even though we're outside Brexit. So I think the thing is, you know, you can build lots of houses in parts of the world, you know, where not, I won't say where people don't want to live, but just where the shortage isn't so acute. But I think we need more houses in the southeast of England and that sort of part of the world. And London, you think London is a big city, but, you know, I travel, you know, as Dawn was saying, you travel around the world. It's not really a very big city, really. It's you know, you see a lot of much bigger cities, you know, go to China, you know, I think London would be a third tier city or something, or second tier city. So, you know, it's nothing like, you know, Mumbai or Calcutta.
I'll go to you next, but can I just quickly ask Calvin what you do? What do you think needs to happen? Go on, in a little nugget, what do you think needs to happen?
What I'd probably do is I would seek to rebalance UK tax and regulation to move money into industry and away from services and property. Right. Because I think we've overinvested in what will turn out to be a property bubble in the last 50 years, and most of that's been in the southeast. So I think there's a real dysfunction in how we invest in the UK compared to, say, Germany, which means we don't have strong regional economies which don't depend on London. So I think there's an issue around, certainly, Huw's right, but the geography of Europe and the UK, we've doubled and tripled down on that since 1980 with encouraging financial services, property development, which I think has been an issue.
More national investment in.
I sort of agree with that, but you know, as a counter argument, you know, France is very much a Paris-dominated place, and Republic of Ireland. You know, look at Dublin. You know, so. I think we need to spread things around, but you know, we are the most densely populated. If you look at that square, you know, Edinburgh down to London, London to Bristol, and Cardiff's just outside, but you can almost count Cardiff and Liverpool, etc. You know, half the population, that little circle for the world, they live in that. It's one of the most densely packed parts of Europe. I think Holland is the only one competitor, and you know, France and Germany, they got much more space. Spain, particularly, they got much more space than us. So yeah, I don't no answer. So yeah.
I think it's fair to say we have contrasting views often in the economic section of Cardiff Business School. So thank you. And your question.
Yeah, thanks. Matt Kelly from DevBank. So it comes back to that same point really around the supply side for growth. And there's a sort of question mark here. Obviously, housing's come up as a major government policy. But I was wondering, in your work, are you seeing any signals coming through from, you know, effectively the build out of grid capacity? It seems that energy is very big, obviously, in South Wales as a major piece for growth. Is it showing up at the UK level for GDP growth at this point, or is it down to the statistics that the investment hasn't come yet and therefore you don't see it, or is it?
I'm not an expert on energy, so I'll say that first. But you know, we have the highest energy prices in Europe, or possibly the world, but certainly in Europe. And you know, energy, you know, is a long-term policy, and it's not clear to me that you know, you need to think ahead decades, and governments don't tend to do that. And you know, clearly green energy, things like that, there's a great potential for expansion there, and also possibly nuclear as well. But there hasn't, you know, I haven't really seen any big evidence of a clear government plan on what to do. I don't know if you may be more of an expert in this area. So I just give a cautious thing. I think that we need more energy infrastructure, definitely. Like I just mentioned, water infrastructure. We need a lot more infrastructure in general. So, how that's going to be planned, is it being planned? The thing is, the government used to do a lot of these things. My father had a job in the Yorkshire Electricity Board, when it was nationalised. A lot of these things were nationalised industries, and they had sort of fairly long-term points of view. We've privatised these industries now, and they're all fragmented, many of them foreign-owned. And, I get my electricity from Electricité de France, EDF, and I'm not sure whether they're looking at the long-term interests of the British economy or not. So it's not quite clear. Once the government, since privatisation, the government has lost, if you like, some control that it used to have over these things. And I'm not quite sure what it's replaced it with. An Ofgem, I'm not that impressed with Ofgem, I must admit. It doesn't seem to necessarily, a bit like the other regulatory agencies, there's a bit of regulatory capture whereby they get taken over by the industries they're supposed to be regulating. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Thank you. One question, final question online.
Yeah, one question from our brilliant online audience who are tolerating my navigating teams this morning. Question from Joanne Popham. Is there research or information on the effects of the Spring Statement on the future of the third sector, Huw?
The short answer is no. So I can't really give it. So I can't really give an answer to that. So I'll rather than speculate, I'll remain quiet. So you can ask another question if you want.
Any final questions? Oh yeah, thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Sarah. Should be on. Okay.
Turn my volume down.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Dixon. It's Roger from Advocacy Support Cymru, one of the third sector organisations referenced.
All right.
And at one with the first question, by the way, particularly its impact on Wales. My question is quite a simplistic one. What difference would it make if the UK, and by definition Wales, remained in the European Union? Given the fact that Europe seems to be in the low growth area, with the exception of what looked like Poland and Bulgaria.
Poland's doing very well, yes.
So yeah, it's a very simple question. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that Europe's doing quite badly. That we saw the figures for the G7, and I think that's largely due to the Russo-Ukrainian war and ensuing sanctions. Because, like if you're a country like Germany, they used to have quite a lot of trade, but just geographically, they used to trade a lot with Russia. They used to get all that cheap Russian gas, and starting with the events in 2014, and sanctions gradually, and then the war in 2022. Well, that's really impacted them much more directly. And we have the highest energy prices now, but Germany's gone from having the cheapest energy in Europe to being a little bit behind us, not much behind us. They've got very expensive energy. So I think that the effect of the war has been quite dramatic there. But having said that, Poland is next door, as it were, to Belarus anyway, and they're doing very, very well. I think the success of Poland is quite exceptional. And I think it's probably, I'm not an expert on the Polish economy. One of my colleagues, Wojtek, is. I don't know what he'd say, but it's probably due to, good economic policy that Poland's been running for the last years. And I think the Baltic states in general have had quite a good policy. And in particularly, they weren't knocked down by the great financial crisis. They took some dramatic action, I seem to remember. Whereas we just borrowed money to see our way through the crisis. They actually took some more dramatic action back then. But I can't really comment on Poland because I don't know about it. So yeah, we're doing. So if we'd remained in Europe, we'd probably be in a similar situation. So in that sense, but that doesn't mean that Brexit didn't have an effect. I think it's made things worse for us. But and in fact, I argued against Brexit. But it wouldn't. We would still be in a low growth situation whether or not Brexit had occurred.
So thank you so much. Let's bring this event to a close. Really brilliant, Huw, and fantastic to have your lovely way of explaining the realities of the situation. And you weren't in charge of making any of it happen, were you? You're just commenting on what it means for different groups. And we're really grateful for that perspective. So thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Thanks to John Parry-Jones. I think one of your last things to do, we should get Wojciech in to talk about Poland, maybe.
Yeah.
That'd be a really good session.
The two really successful economies are Ireland, the Republic of Ireland,
Yeah.
and Poland.
Okay, note to self, put it on the list, John, before you leave. And thanks so much for coming, and hopefully see you at another event soon. Thanks.